Welcome to the end of the world. Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into one of history's darkest corners. But don't worry, we're doing it in the most sleep-inducing way possible. So go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable under your blankets, and let your eyelids get heavy. We're heading underground tonight, into a concrete tomb beneath Berlin, where the most infamous dictator in modern history spent his final days watching everything he built crumble into ash and rubble. This is the story of Adolf Hitler's last weeks in the Führerbunker. And trust me, it's less dramatic explosion and more pathetic whimper than you'd think. Now, before we descend into that damp, cramped bunker complex beneath the Reich's Chancellery Garden, we need to set the scene. Because by early 1945, the 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was looking more like a very rough 12 years. The war that was supposed to give Germany dominance over Europe had turned into an absolute nightmare. Soviet forces were closing in from the east, American and British forces from the west, and the entire Nazi war machine was basically held together with duct tape and denial at this point. Let's float back to January 1945. Hitler had just moved permanently into the bunker complex beneath Berlin. Now, this wasn't his first time hiding underground. He'd been using various bunker systems throughout the war, but this would be his last address. The Führerbunker was actually the lower level of a two-part bunker system. The upper bunker, called the Führerbunker, had been built first in 1943. Then, because apparently one bunker wasn't enough, they dug deeper and built the Führerbunker proper in 1944. This lower bunker sat about 8.5 meters underground, had walls of reinforced concrete about 4 meters thick, and was designed to withstand pretty much anything the Allies could drop on it. The bunker itself was divided into roughly 18 rooms, which sounds spacious until you realize some of these rooms were basically closets. There was Hitler's personal suite, which included a small bedroom, a sitting room, and a bathroom. There were quarters for Eva Braun, his longtime companion who everyone pretended didn't exist for most of the war. There was a map room where Hitler held his increasingly delusional military conferences, a telephone switchboard room, quarters for various staff members, guards, and officials, a small surgery, and some mechanical rooms for the ventilation system that barely worked. The whole thing was cramped, damp, and depressing, basically like living in a very expensive concrete coffin. The ventilation was terrible, by the way. The air was thick and stale. People smoked constantly down there because, of course they did, so you had this permanent fog of cigarette smoke mixing with the smell of diesel from the generators, mold from the dampness, and the general stench of too many unwashed people living in close quarters. The lighting was harsh and artificial, fluorescent bulbs that gave everything a sickly greenish tint. There were no windows, obviously, no natural light, no sense of time beyond the clocks on the walls. It was, in every sense, the perfect place to watch your dreams die. By January, Hitler was already showing serious signs of physical and mental decline. The man who had once commanded massive rallies and mesmerized crowds was now a shuffling, trembling wreck. He was 55 years old, but looked about 75. His left hand shook constantly, possibly from Parkinson's disease, though his quack doctor, Theodore Morell, had been pumping him full of so many drugs for so long that it's honestly hard to say what was wrong with him anymore. We're talking about a man who was getting daily injections of amphetamines, along with a cocktail of other medications that included everything from testosterone to strychnine. Yes, strychnine. Small doses, supposedly, for his stomach problems, but still, poison. He was taking poison as medicine. His walk had become a shuffle. His posture was stooped, his face was pale and puffy, his eyes, which had once been so piercing in all that propaganda footage, were now watery and bloodshot. He drooled sometimes when he ate. His hands shook so badly that he had to eat with his right hand while using his left to steady his right wrist. It was, frankly, pathetic. This was the man who had conquered most of Europe just a few years earlier. But here's the thing about Hitler in those final months. His mind was still sharp in some ways, even if his body was falling apart. He could still recall detailed statistics about weapons production, still argue about military strategy, still rant for hours about his grand visions and the betrayals he imagined everywhere around him. The problem was that his grand visions had basically no connection to reality anymore. He was planning counteroffensives with armies that didn't exist. He was moving divisions on maps when those divisions had maybe a few dozen actual soldiers left. He was convinced that secret wonder weapons would turn the tide of the war any day now. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Let's talk about who else was down in this concrete tomb with him, because the cast of characters is honestly fascinating in a deeply dysfunctional way. First, there was Eva Braun, his longtime mistress, who had been kept hidden from the German public for most of their relationship. Hitler had this weird thing about maintaining his image as a man married to Germany itself, so Eva had always been kept in the background. But now, with everything falling apart, she had chosen to come to Berlin and join him in the bunker. She arrived on April 15th, against his wishes actually. He'd told her to stay away, to stay safe in Munich. She came anyway. Love? Delusion? A death wish? Probably all three. Then there was Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who had been with Hitler since the early days of the Nazi Party. Goebbels was a true believer, one of the few who never wavered in his loyalty. He was also a man who apparently decided that if the Third Reich was going down, he and his entire family were going down with it. He moved into the bunker with his wife Magda and their 6 children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, and Heidi. Yes, they all had names starting with H, for Hitler, because that's not creepy at all. Martin Bormann was there, Hitler's personal secretary and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, despite being relatively unknown to the public. Bormann was a bureaucrat, basically, the guy who controlled access to Hitler and therefore controlled a massive amount of power. He was also intensely loyal and deeply involved in documenting everything that happened in the bunker. A lot of what we know about those final days comes from Bormann's messages and notes. There were military officers rotating in and out, generals who would come up from their own bunkers or field positions to attend Hitler's military conferences, then leave as quickly as possible because nobody wanted to be down there longer than necessary. The most constant military presence was General Wilhelm Burgdorf, who was basically drunk all the time by the end, and General Hans Krebs, who was the last chief of the general staff and got to enjoy that position for all of 2 weeks before everything ended. Hitler's personal physician, the aforementioned Dr. Theodor Morell, was there for a while, though he'd eventually leave in late April. Morell was a quack who had made a fortune by attaching himself to Hitler and prescribing increasingly bizarre treatments. By the end, Hitler was taking dozens of different medications daily. Morell kept detailed records of every injection, every pill, every treatment, which is how we know just how drugged up Hitler really was. There were secretaries, most notably Traud Junge, who would later write about her experiences in the bunker. She was young, in her mid-20s, and had been one of Hitler's personal secretaries since 1942. Her accounts of the bunker days are some of the most detailed we have, partly because she was one of the few who survived and was willing to talk about it later. There were SS guards, of course, lots of them. The bunker was guarded by members of the SS Begleit Kommando, Hitler's personal protection unit. These were young men, fanatically loyal, heavily armed, and increasingly aware that they were probably going to die in that bunker. And there were various other hangers-on, adjutants, drivers, cooks, telephone operators, valets. At any given time, there were probably 30 to 40 people crammed into that bunker complex, living on top of each other in the most claustrophobic and depressing conditions imaginable. The daily routine in the bunker was, honestly, pretty bleak. Hitler would usually wake up late, around noon or even later, because he'd been up until 3 or 4 in the morning the night before. His sleep schedule had always been erratic, but by 1945 it was completely backwards. He'd have a light breakfast, which for him usually meant tea and some pastries, because despite being a vegetarian, he apparently had a serious sweet tooth. Then he'd shuffle to the map room for the first military conference of the day. These military conferences were where the real delusion happened. Officers would give reports on the military situation, which was universally terrible, and Hitler would respond by ordering counterattacks, using forces that didn't exist, or moving armies that were already destroyed or surrounded. When generals tried to explain reality to him, he'd fly into rages, accusing them of defeatism or treason or cowardice. He'd insist that the will to fight was more important than actual tanks or ammunition. He'd blame his generals for not following his orders properly. He'd talk about how if the German people weren't strong enough to win, they deserved to be destroyed. It was, basically, a preview of a toddler's meltdown, except this toddler had once commanded the most powerful military in Europe. After the military conference, there might be lunch, which was usually served in Hitler's personal quarters. He'd eat his vegetarian meal while everyone else had whatever was available, and as the siege tightened, what was available became less and less appetizing. By the end, they were eating canned food and whatever could be scrounged from the Reich Chancellery kitchens above ground, assuming the building hadn't been hit by another artillery shell that day. Afternoons would be spent in meetings with various officials, or sometimes Hitler would just sit around with his secretaries and talk. He loved to talk, especially about his past, about the early days of the Nazi Party, about his grand architectural plans for rebuilding Berlin into the capital of his empire. None of which was going to happen now, obviously, but he'd talk about it anyway. His secretaries would sit there politely nodding while he rambled on about concert halls and triumphal arches that would never be built. Eva Braun spent most of her time trying to keep spirits up, which was a losing battle. She'd organized little parties, breaking out champagne that had been stored in the bunker, playing music on a gramophone, trying to get people to dance or at least smile. It was surreal, trying to party while Soviet artillery pounded the city above them, while the Reich crumbled, while death literally closed in from all sides. But Eva was determined to maintain some sense of normalcy, or at least the appearance of it. She'd dress nicely, do her hair and makeup, wear jewelry. She'd be cheerful and upbeat, at least on the surface. Whether this was denial or courage or just good old-fashioned compartmentalization is anyone's guess. Evenings would bring another military conference, usually around 10 p.m. or midnight, and then Hitler would stay up for hours more, talking with whoever was still awake, which was usually Goebbels and Bormann. They'd sit around discussing philosophy or history or Wagner operas or various conspiracy theories about who had betrayed them. Because by this point, Hitler was convinced that everyone had betrayed him. The generals had betrayed him, the German people had betrayed him, his closest allies had betrayed him. Even Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, two of his oldest and most powerful subordinates, would betray him before the end. Let's talk about the outside world for a moment, because while all this was happening in the bunker, Berlin was being systematically destroyed. The Battle of Berlin had started on April 16, 1945, when Soviet forces launched their final assault on the city. The Red Army had been planning this for months. They had overwhelming superiority in numbers, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was attacking from the east, Marshal Konev from the south. Between them, they had something like 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces. The Germans had maybe 100,000 actual trained soldiers, supplemented by old men from the Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth Boys, and basically anyone who could hold a rifle.
It wasn't even close to a fair fight. The Soviets just pounded the city with artillery, tens of thousands of shells every day, turning buildings into rubble, starting fires everywhere, killing thousands of civilians who were trapped in the city. The sky above Berlin was constantly dark with smoke. The sound of explosions was continuous. Soviet troops fought their way through the suburbs, then into the city proper, taking it block by block, building by building. German defenders would set up in a building, hold out for a few hours or maybe a day, then get overrun or retreat to the next position. It was brutal, grinding combat, and everyone knew how it was going to end. Down in the bunker, they could hear it all. The artillery shells exploding above ground would make the bunker shake. Dust would fall from the concrete ceiling. The lights would flicker. Everyone would freeze for a moment, wondering if this was the shell that would finally break through all that reinforced concrete and bury them alive. It never did. The bunker was incredibly well built, but the psychological effect of sitting underground while your entire world literally exploded around you must have been intense. Hitler's reaction to all of this was, somehow, to become even more detached from reality. He'd look at maps and see the Soviet forces closing in, and he'd order counterattacks. He'd insist that General Walther Wenck's 12th Army would break through and relieve Berlin, except Wenck's army was tiny, exhausted, and already fighting for its life. Or he'd talk about how Frederick the Great had once been on the brink of defeat and then was saved at the last moment, so surely Germany would be saved too. This was his favorite historical analogy in those final weeks. Frederick the Great and the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, when Frederick's enemies had fallen apart just when all seemed lost. Hitler was convinced the same thing would happen to him, a miracle. The alliance between the Soviets and the Western Allies would collapse, they'd turn on each other, and Germany would be saved. This was not going to happen. Everyone around him knew it wasn't going to happen, but nobody wanted to be the one to tell him because Hitler did not handle bad news well. So they'd nod and agree and say, "Yes, my Führer," and then go back to their rooms and contemplate the various ways they might die in the next few days. By late April, the situation was beyond desperate. Soviet forces were in the city center. They were fighting in the Tiergarten, the big park in central Berlin, which was only about a mile from the Reich Chancellery. They were getting closer every day, every hour really. You could hear Soviet infantry and tanks fighting German defenders just streets away. The bunker was effectively surrounded, though they could still get messages in and out via radio, and there was still a small airstrip nearby where a few planes could land. And it was in this context, the world literally ending around him, his capital in flames, his armies destroyed, his empire collapsed, that Adolf Hitler finally started to face the fact that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to work out the way he'd planned. But before we get to the final days, we need to talk about some of the key events that happened in mid to late April, because there were a few moments of drama that really pushed Hitler over the edge into his final decisions. Moments that showed him that not only was the war lost, but the people he'd trusted most had given up on him too. Let's start with Hermann Göring. The betrayals begin. Hermann Göring was, at least on paper, Hitler's designated successor. He'd been with Hitler since the early 1920s, had been a World War I flying ace, was the head of the Luftwaffe, and held about a dozen other important titles. He was also, by 1945, a morphine-addicted, obese, metal-covered caricature of himself who spent most of his time at his various estates collecting art, much of it stolen from Jews, and generally living like a Renaissance prince while Germany burned. But technically, he was still the number 2 guy in the Nazi hierarchy. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, there was a meeting in the bunker where basically everyone told Hitler he should leave Berlin and head south to Berchtesgaden, where he could continue directing the war from the Bavarian Alps. Hitler refused. He said he'd stay in Berlin, fight to the end. This was probably the moment when everyone realized he was seriously planning to die here. After the meeting, Göring left the bunker and headed south. He'd already moved most of his stolen art collection and his family to Bavaria, so off he went, presumably thinking he was getting out while he still could. A couple days later, on April 22nd, Hitler had one of his most spectacular meltdowns. There was a military conference where he was told that an SS unit he'd been counting on for the defense of Berlin, the SS Division Steiner, hadn't been able to launch the attack he'd ordered. General Karl Kahler, who was representing the Luftwaffe, tried to explain that Steiner didn't have enough forces to attack. Hitler completely lost it. He started screaming that everyone had betrayed him, that the generals were all incompetent cowards, that the war was lost. He ranted for hours. People who were there said it was the worst they'd ever seen him. He finally collapsed into a chair and said, essentially, that it was all over. He was staying in Berlin, and he was going to shoot himself when the Soviets arrived. This was significant because it was the first time Hitler had openly admitted the war was lost. Everyone in the bunker was shocked. His secretaries were crying. Officers were standing around looking uncomfortable. Goebbels was probably the only one who seemed almost relieved. He'd been waiting for Hitler to accept reality so they could all have a good dramatic ending together. Now, word of this breakdown got out to the various Nazi officials who weren't in the bunker. And Hermann Göring, sitting in Bavaria, heard that Hitler had said the war was lost and he was staying in Berlin to die. Goering apparently thought, well, if he's planning to die, I guess that means I'm in charge now. So on April 23rd, Goering sent a telegram to Hitler. It was, honestly, pretty reasonable given the circumstances. Goering basically said, "Hey, I heard you're staying in Berlin and planning to die. According to the decree from 1941 that made me your successor, does this mean I should take over leadership of the Reich? If I don't hear from you by 10 p.m. tonight, I'll assume you agree and start acting as your successor. No offense intended, just trying to follow protocol here." Hitler, naturally, did not see it this way. Martin Bormann, who absolutely hated Goering and had been trying to undermine him for years, saw his chance. He showed Hitler the telegram and spun it as a betrayal, a coup attempt, Goering trying to steal power while Hitler was still alive. Hitler, who was already paranoid and unstable, exploded. He sent back a telegram stripping Goering of all his positions and essentially placing him under house arrest. The telegram was brutal. "You have committed high treason, but because of your past services, you won't be executed if you resign all your positions immediately." So, Goering was out. The designated successor, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, gone in a telegram. Goering, to his credit, accepted it pretty calmly and spent the rest of the war under SS guard at his estate, probably thinking he'd gotten off lucky by being kicked out of the club before the building collapsed on everyone inside. But wait, there's more betrayal to come, because just a couple days later, Heinrich Himmler decided to get in on the abandoning Hitler action. Himmler was the head of the SS, one of the most powerful men in Germany, responsible for the Holocaust and pretty much every major atrocity the Nazis committed. He was also, apparently, completely delusional about his prospects after the war. In late April, Himmler had been secretly negotiating with Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat, trying to arrange a surrender to the Western Allies. Himmler seemed to think that the Americans and British would accept Germany's surrender if Hitler was out of the picture, and that they'd maybe let him stay in some kind of government position because, I don't know, he was such a great administrator? This is a man who ran the Holocaust, thinking the Allies might want to work with him. The mind boggles. On April 28th, the BBC reported that Himmler had been trying to negotiate a surrender. Someone in the bunker heard the broadcast and told Hitler. And this was the final straw. If the Goering telegram had made Hitler angry, the Himmler betrayal broke something fundamental in him. Himmler wasn't just any Nazi. He was Der Treue Henrik, loyal Henrik, the one guy Hitler thought would never abandon him. And now even he was trying to negotiate surrender behind Hitler's back. Hitler's reaction was swift and brutal. He couldn't get to Himmler directly. Himmler was smart enough to stay far away from Berlin. But Hermann Fegelein, the SS liaison to Hitler, and also Eva Braun's brother-in-law, was in the bunker. Fegelein had actually tried to leave Berlin a day or two earlier, probably sensing which way the wind was blowing. He'd gotten to his apartment in the city, changed into civilian clothes, and was possibly planning to disappear. But he was found, dragged back to the bunker, and when the news about Himmler broke, Hitler had Fegelein taken up to the Reich Chancellery garden and shot. Just like that. Eva Braun, by the way, didn't intervene to save her sister's husband. Make of that what you will. So by April 28th, Hitler's two most powerful subordinates had betrayed him. One of them had been executed, and everyone else in the bunker was just waiting for the end. The Soviet forces were literally streets away. You could hear Russian being spoken by soldiers a few blocks from the Reich Chancellery. Artillery shells were hitting the building constantly. The garden above the bunker was a cratered wasteland. The only way in or out was through an emergency exit that led to the garden, and even that was getting dangerous because Soviet snipers had good sight lines on the area. This was in the context when Hitler decided to get married. Because apparently, when your empire is collapsing and you have maybe 48 hours to live, that's the perfect time for a wedding.
A wedding in the tomb. On the evening of April 28th, Hitler told his staff he wanted to marry Eva Braun. This wasn't entirely surprising. Eva had been with him for years, and she'd come to Berlin specifically to die with him, so I guess he figured he might as well make it official before they both swallowed cyanide or whatever the plan was. The problem was finding someone who could legally perform a marriage ceremony. They needed a civil official, and most of those were either dead, fled, or fighting Soviet troops in the rubble. Someone eventually found Walter Wagner, a city councilor who was fighting with the Volkssturm nearby. Wagner was brought to the bunker, probably wondering what the hell was going on, and found himself officiating the wedding of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun in a little map room while artillery shells exploded overhead. The ceremony was brief. Hitler and Eva both had to confirm they were of pure Aryan descent and had no hereditary diseases, because even at the end of the world, the Nazis couldn't let go of their racial obsession. Eva started to sign the marriage certificate as Eva B., then crossed out the B and wrote Eva Hitler, née Braun. It's this tiny moment that's kind of heartbreaking in a weird way. She'd waited years to use his name, and she got to be Eva Hitler for about 40 hours before they both died. After the ceremony, there was a small wedding reception in Hitler's personal quarters. They broke out champagne that had been stored in the bunker. Goebbels and Bormann were there, along with Hitler's secretaries and a few other staff members. Everyone toasted the newlyweds and tried to pretend this was a normal celebration and not a wake. Hitler apparently relaxed a bit during the party, talking about the old days, reminiscing about the early years of the Nazi movement. It was probably the closest thing to a pleasant evening anyone had in that bunker. But the party couldn't last forever. Eventually, Hitler withdrew to his study with his secretary Traddle Jung and started dictating his last will and testament. Actually, he dictated two documents, a personal will and a political testament, because even when you're about to kill yourself, you've got to leave behind some paperwork, right? The personal will was relatively short. He left his possessions to the Nazi Party, or if the party no longer existed, to the German state. He said that he and his wife were choosing death over the shame of surrender. He appointed Martin Bormann as the executor. It was straightforward, if incredibly depressing. The political testament was longer and, honestly, kind of fascinating as a document of complete and utter denial. Hitler spent pages explaining that he never wanted war. The war was forced on him by international Jewish conspirators. He claimed he'd tried repeatedly for peace, but the Allies rejected all his offers. He blamed the German generals for losing the war through their incompetence and cowardice. He blamed the German people for not being strong enough to win. He blamed everyone except himself. Then he got into the succession issue. He stripped Goering and Himmler of their positions officially and kicked them out of the party. He appointed Admiral Dönitz as the new president of the Reich and supreme commander of the armed forces. Why Dönitz? Probably because Dönitz commanded the submarine fleet and had always been loyal, and also because basically everyone else was either dead, captured, or betrayed him. Goebbels was appointed chancellor. Bormann was made party minister. Various other positions were assigned to various other officials, most of whom probably had no idea they were being given jobs in a government that would last about a week. But here's my favorite part of the political testament. Even now, even at the very end, Hitler couldn't help himself. The last paragraph is a call for Germans to continue the racial struggle. He wrote that above all, the German government and people must uphold the racial laws and resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry. That's what he was thinking about in his final hours. Not the millions dead, not the destroyed cities, not the suffering he'd caused. He was still worried about his racial conspiracy theories. The man was consistent, you've got to give him that. The documents were signed and witnessed in the early morning hours of April 29th. Copies were made, and messengers were designated to try to get them out of Berlin to Dönitz and other officials. It's actually kind of amazing that these documents survived. Multiple copies were carried by different people trying to escape the city, and at least one set made it through the Soviet lines. After finishing the paperwork, Hitler apparently went to bed for a few hours. It was now April 29th, and the Soviets were literally hundreds of meters away. The Reich's chancellery was being hit by constant artillery fire. The bunker shook with every explosion. The air was thick with smoke and dust, even down in the shelter. The electric lights flickered. The ventilation system was struggling. Food was running low. Not that anyone was eating anyway. Everyone was just waiting. The final day.
April 30th, 1945, the last day of Adolf Hitler's life. Let's just drift through it slowly, because honestly, there wasn't that much drama. It was mostly just sad and quiet and grim. Hitler woke up late, as usual, probably around 11 a.m. or noon. He had a light meal, some soup maybe. His hands were shaking worse than usual. He could barely hold his spoon. His valet had to help him. This man who had once commanded armies could barely feed himself. There was a military briefing in the early afternoon where the remaining officers gave their reports. The news was, unsurprisingly, terrible. Soviet forces were now within a block or two of the Reich Chancellery. They'd be at the bunker entrance by evening at the latest. There was no possibility of relief. No reinforcements were coming. It was over. Hitler listened to the reports without saying much. He didn't rant. He didn't order imaginary counterattacks. He just nodded and looked at the maps. He was done. You could see it in his eyes, according to the people who were there. He'd given up. After the briefing, around 2 or 3 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun went into their private quarters and closed the door. This was around 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945. Outside, in the bunker corridor, everyone just waited. Goebbels and Bormann stood near the door. Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, waited nearby. His adjutant, Otto Günsche, stood guard. The secretaries had retreated to another room. Everyone was just standing around in silence, waiting for a gunshot. They waited about 10 minutes, maybe 15. The accounts vary slightly. Then they heard it, a single shot, just one. Not loud, muffled by the door and the thick concrete walls, but everyone knew what it meant. They waited a few more minutes. Nobody wanted to be the first to open the door. Finally, Linge and Bormann and Goebbels went in, and there they were. Hitler was sitting on a sofa, slumped to one side. He'd shot himself through the right temple. His pistol, a Walther PPK 7.65 millimeter, was on the floor near his feet. There was blood on the wall behind him and running down his face, but not as much blood as you might think. Head wounds bleed, but he wasn't like covered in gore, just blood down the side of his face and on his shirt. Eva was sitting next to him, also dead, but there was no visible wound on her. She'd taken cyanide. There was a smell of bitter almonds in the air, prussic acid, the telltale scent of cyanide poisoning. Her face was relaxed, almost peaceful. Hitler's face was not peaceful. His eyes were open. His mouth was twisted. There's been some debate over the years about whether Hitler also took cyanide before he shot himself, or whether he only shot himself. The most reliable accounts suggest he probably did both, bit down on a cyanide capsule, and then shot himself just to be absolutely sure. Because if there's one thing Hitler excelled at, it's overkill. The people in the room just stood there for a moment, looking at the bodies. Then they got to work. They had orders to burn the bodies, and Soviet troops were so close that they needed to do it fast. They wrapped Hitler's body in a blanket. They picked up Eva's body. Then they carried them up the stairs to the emergency exit that led to the Reich Chancellery garden. Getting the bodies up and out was apparently quite difficult. The stairs were narrow, the bodies were heavy, Hitler was dead weight, and despite his physical decline, he was still a grown man. They had to stop several times. The bunker was shaking from artillery hits. Dust was falling from the ceiling. They could hear gunfire from nearby streets. Finally, they got the bodies outside into the garden. Except it wasn't really a garden anymore. It was a bomb crater-filled wasteland. The ground was torn up. There were shell holes everywhere. Pieces of rubble and debris scattered all around. The buildings of the Reich Chancellery were burning. The sky was dark with smoke. You could hear artillery and small arms fire all around. They laid the bodies in a shallow shell crater. Then they poured gasoline over them. They used about 180 liters of gasoline total. They'd been stockpiling it in the bunker specifically for this purpose. Linge or Günsche lit a piece of paper and tossed it onto the bodies. The gasoline caught fire immediately. The people who'd carried the bodies out stood near the bunker entrance watching the bodies burn. They gave a Nazi salute, because even now, even with everything collapsing, the ritual mattered. Then they went back down into the bunker. They left the bodies burning in the crater. The fire burned for a while. Accounts vary on how long, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3. But here's the thing about burning a human body. It's actually really hard to completely destroy a corpse with just gasoline. You need sustained, intense heat to fully cremate a body, like in a crematorium. A gasoline fire in an open crater, while hot, isn't quite enough. So while the bodies burned significantly, they weren't completely destroyed. Later that evening, some of the staff went back up to check on the bodies. They found charred remains, still recognizable as human bodies, but badly burned. They shoveled some dirt over them and went back down. That was it. Adolf Hitler's funeral was a gasoline fire in a bomb crater while Soviet shells exploded nearby. No ceremony, no speeches. Just flames and smoke and the sound of artillery. Down in the bunker, life, if you can call it that, continued for a little while longer. Goebbels was technically the chancellor, though that meant basically nothing at this point. He sent a telegram to Admiral Dönitz informing him that Hitler was dead and that Dönitz was now the head of state. Then Goebbels prepared for his own end. On the evening of May 1st, the day after Hitler's death, Magda Goebbels took her 6 children to bed. Helga was 12, Hilda was 11, Helmut was 9, Hulda was 7, Hedda was 5, and little Heidi was just 4. Magda apparently told them they were going to get an injection to help them sleep because of all the noise from the fighting. The children, trusting their mother, didn't resist. A doctor, probably Dr. Helmut Kunz, though accounts vary, gave each child a morphine injection to knock them out. Then, once they were unconscious, Magda went to each child and forced a cyanide capsule into their mouths, crushing it with her fingers. All 6 children died within minutes. Their mother had murdered them rather than let them live in a world without Hitler. After the children were dead, Joseph and Magda Goebbels went up to the garden. They had an SS guard shoot them both. Their bodies were also burned, though not as thoroughly as Hitler's. The guard apparently used less gasoline and didn't wait to make sure the bodies were completely burned. By this point, everyone was just trying to get out of the bunker before the Soviets arrived. And the Soviets were arriving. On May 1st and 2nd, various bunker personnel either tried to escape or committed suicide. Some made it out of the bunker complex and tried to flee through the subway tunnels or through the rubble of Berlin. Many succeeded in escaping the city. Some killed themselves rather than be captured. Martin Bormann tried to escape on the night of May 1st. He made it out of the bunker and several blocks through the ruins before he either killed himself or was killed. The exact details of his death are still debated. His remains weren't definitively identified until the 1970s. General Bergdorf and General Krebs both committed suicide in the bunker. Otto Gunsche, Hitler's adjutant, was captured by the Soviets and spent 10 years in Soviet prison camps. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, was also captured and imprisoned. The secretaries, Traudl Jung and Gerda Christian, managed to escape the bunker and eventually made it through Soviet lines to the western part of Germany. On May 2, 1945, Soviet troops finally entered the Reich Chancellery and the bunker complex. They found it mostly empty, just a few bodies, some papers, and evidence of hasty departures. They searched the garden and found several burned corpses in shell craters. They collected these remains, but initially weren't sure which one was Hitler.
The aftermath and the myths. So, Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was effectively over. Germany would officially surrender on May 7th to 8th. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months. Berlin was a ruined wasteland. Germany was divided and occupied. Millions were dead. And in a bomb crater in what was left of the Reich Chancellery Garden, there were some charred remains that might or might not be Adolf Hitler. The Soviets, by the way, were really weird about the whole thing. They found what they believed were Hitler's remains on May 4th, but they didn't announce it. They kept it secret. Why? Partly because Stalin was paranoid and didn't want to announce anything until he was absolutely certain. Partly because the Soviets wanted to make sure the Western Allies didn't get any propaganda value out of finding Hitler's body. And partly because keeping it mysterious was useful. If everyone thought Hitler might still be alive, it was easier to blame him for things and paint the Western Allies as potentially harboring him. The Soviets conducted an autopsy on the remains they'd found. The body was badly burned, but there was enough left to do an examination.
They identified the remains as Hitler's based on several factors. Most importantly, they had Hitler's dental records, and the teeth and jawbone of the corpse matched those records perfectly. Hitler had pretty distinctive dental work: multiple bridges, missing teeth, gold crowns. The teeth from the corpse were an exact match. They also found what appeared to be Eva Braun's body nearby, along with the bodies of 2 dogs, probably Blondie and her puppies. And they found the Goebbels family, Joseph, Magda, and the 6 children. The children's bodies were in the bunker. The parents' bodies were in the garden, partially burned. But the Soviets didn't announce any of this publicly. Instead, they let rumors spread. They questioned captured German officers about whether Hitler was really dead. They let Western newspapers speculate about whether Hitler had escaped. There were theories that he'd flown out at the last minute and was hiding in South America or Antarctica or wherever. These theories persisted for years, even decades. In reality, the Soviets had Hitler's remains. They'd done an autopsy, confirmed the identity, and then they just kind of kept the body. They moved it around several times over the years. Eventually, it ended up buried in a military facility in Magdeburg, East Germany, and there it stayed, buried in an unmarked grave for decades. In 1970, the Soviet KGB decided that maintaining Hitler's burial site was becoming a security risk. They were worried it might become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis if its location ever became known. So they dug up the remains, burned them again, more thoroughly this time, crushed the ashes, and scattered them in a river. They kept only a fragment of skull with a bullet hole and part of the jawbone as proof that they'd really had Hitler's body. Except there's some controversy about even that. In 2009, archaeologists examined the skull fragment that the Russians claimed was Hitler's and found that DNA evidence suggested it was actually from a woman, probably in her 40s. So maybe that skull fragment wasn't Hitler's at all. Maybe it was Eva Braun's, or maybe it was from someone else entirely. The jawbone fragments are probably authentic. They match the dental records too perfectly to be fake. But the skull, who knows? The truth is, we'll probably never have 100% physical proof of what happened to Hitler's body. We have witness testimonies from the people who were there. We have the autopsy reports from the Soviets. We have dental records. We have the general consensus of historians that Hitler died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, in the Führerbunker, and his body was burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden. But the physical remains are mostly gone, scattered in a river somewhere in Germany. And honestly, that's probably for the best. The last thing the world needs is a grave or burial site that could become a shrine for extremists. Hitler wanted to avoid becoming a trophy for his enemies. He ended up as ashes in a river, remembered not as a great leader or conqueror, but as the architect of one of history's greatest catastrophes. His empire lasted just over a decade. His body was burned in a crater. His legacy is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, racial hatred, and totalitarianism. The people who were there. Let's drift through what happened to some of the other people who were in the bunker during those final days, because their stories are kind of interesting in their own ways. Trottel Young, one of Hitler's secretaries, managed to escape Berlin. She survived the war and lived until 2002. In her later years, she wrote and spoke about her experiences in the bunker. She struggled with guilt about having worked for Hitler, saying she felt she should have known better, should have questioned what she was doing. She did an extensive interview in 2002 that was later turned into a documentary and also served as one of the main sources for the film Downfall. She remained haunted by her time with Hitler until her death. Gerda Christian, another secretary, also escaped and survived. She was less public about her experiences than Young, but she did give interviews to historians. She died in 1997. Otto Gunsche, Hitler's adjutant who helped burn Hitler's body, was captured by the Soviets and spent 10 years in Soviet prisons and labor camps. He was finally released in 1955 and returned to West Germany. He gave several interviews about the last days in the bunker and died in 2003. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, had a similar fate. Captured by the Soviets, imprisoned for 10 years, released in 1955. He also wrote about his experiences and gave interviews to historians. He died in 1980. Rokas Mish was a telephone operator and bodyguard in the bunker. He was one of the last people to leave the bunker complex alive. He was captured by the Soviets, imprisoned for 9 years, released in 1954. He lived until 2013 and was one of the last surviving eyewitnesses to Hitler's final days. He gave numerous interviews and wrote a memoir about his experiences. Admiral Karl Donitz, who Hitler appointed as his successor in his political testament, took over as head of state after Hitler's death. He held the position for all of 23 days. He negotiated Germany's surrender to the Allies, was then arrested, tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served his full sentence and was released in 1956. He lived until 1980 and spent much of his later life trying to rehabilitate his reputation, with limited success. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, wasn't in the bunker during the final days. He'd visited earlier but had left Berlin. He survived the war, was tried at Nuremberg, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served his full sentence and was released in 1966. Then he wrote several books about his experiences with Hitler, always positioning himself as the good Nazi, who hadn't known about the worst atrocities. Most historians don't buy this. He knew more than he claimed. He died in 1981. Hermann Göring, who had been kicked out of his positions and arrested by the SS in late April 1945, was captured by American forces in Bavaria shortly after the war ended. He was tried at Nuremberg as one of the main war criminals. He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, but he committed suicide by cyanide capsule the night before his execution. He'd hidden the capsule somewhere in his cell. To this day, nobody knows exactly how he managed to keep it hidden for the months of the trial. Heinrich Himmler, who'd tried to negotiate surrender, fled after the war but was captured by British forces in late May 1945. He was in disguise and using false papers, but he was recognized. When he was about to be searched, he bit down on a cyanide capsule he'd hidden in his mouth and died within minutes. So he never faced trial. The Soviet soldiers who captured the bunker and found Hitler's remains mostly remained anonymous. The S-Mersch unit, Soviet counterintelligence, that conducted the investigation was sworn to secrecy. Some of them gave interviews years later after the Soviet Union collapsed, but many took their secrets to their graves.
The bunker today. So, what happened to the Führerbunker itself? Well, that's gone. Sort of. Let me explain. After the Soviets captured Berlin, the bunker complex was mostly sealed up. It was damaged from the fighting, partially flooded, filled with debris. The Soviets explored it, documented it, took photographs, and then basically left it alone. Berlin was divided into occupation zones, and the bunker ended up in the Soviet sector, which became East Berlin. For decades during the Cold War, the bunker just sat there underground, sealed and forgotten. It was under what became a stretch of no man's land between East and West Berlin. Occasionally, urban explorers or historians would try to get in, but it was mostly inaccessible. After German reunification in 1990, the question came up of what to do with the site. There is serious concern that the bunker could become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis if its location was clearly marked, or if the bunker was made accessible. So the German government decided the best approach was to basically destroy it and make it as unremarkable as possible. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, various construction projects in the area systematically destroyed or sealed off most of the bunker complex. The upper bunker was partially demolished. The Führerbunker itself, the lower level, was mostly filled in with concrete and rubble. The emergency exit that Hitler's body was carried through was sealed. Today, the site of the Führerbunker is underneath a parking lot and some apartment buildings in central Berlin. There's a small information board on the sidewalk that explains what used to be there, but that's it. No memorial, no museum, no marker, just a parking lot. And honestly, that feels appropriate. The place where Hitler spent his final days and died is now just an unremarkable piece of Berlin real estate where people park their cars and walk their dogs. The German approach to Nazi historical sites is generally to acknowledge them, but not to make them into shrines or tourist attractions. There's a balance between preserving history and not making pilgrimage sites for extremists. The bunker fell on the better to destroy it side of that balance. Some artifacts from the bunker survived and are in museums. Pieces of furniture, some documents, photographs.
but the physical bunker itself is gone, buried under tons of concrete and modern construction. Urban explorers have occasionally claimed to find access points to parts of the bunker system, but these are generally sealed off quickly when discovered. The historical significance and lasting impact. So let's drift into what all of this means, historically speaking. Why do we care about Hitler's last days in a bunker? Why does this story matter beyond just a morbid curiosity about how a dictator died? First, there's the sheer symbolic weight of it. This was the end of the Third Reich, the collapse of a regime that had conquered most of Europe, murdered millions in the Holocaust, and started the deadliest war in human history. The fact that it ended not with some grand battle or dramatic last stand, but with a suicide in a basement, that's significant. Hitler's empire didn't go out with a bang. It went out with a whimper and a gunshot in a concrete hole in the ground. Second, there's what the bunker days reveal about Hitler as a person. We see him stripped of all the pomp and propaganda. No more massive rallies, no more theatrical speeches, no more carefully staged photographs. Just a sick, broken, paranoid man shuffling around in a cramped shelter, ranting at his subordinates, living in complete denial of reality. It's the ultimate unmasking of the Führer myth. The bunker also serves as a case study in how authoritarian regimes collapse. You had this whole system built around one person's will, and when that person became disconnected from reality, the entire system became dysfunctional. Generals couldn't tell Hitler the truth because he'd explode in rage. Officials were more concerned with their own survival than actually trying to save anything. Everyone was engaged in this collective fiction that somehow things would work out, when it was obvious to everyone that they wouldn't. It's a warning about the dangers of cult of personality leadership. Then there's the question of responsibility and judgment. The fact that Hitler killed himself meant he never faced trial. He never had to sit in a courtroom and answer for his crimes. He never had to face his victims or their families. He just checked out, took the coward's way, and left everyone else to deal with the consequences. Contrast that with the Nuremberg trials, where the surviving Nazi leadership had to sit there and have their crimes documented and judged. Hitler escaped that. Some people, especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, felt cheated by Hitler's suicide. They wanted to see him captured, tried, humiliated, executed. There was a desire for justice, for accountability, for Hitler to face what he'd done. His suicide denied them that. On the other hand, his suicide also meant he couldn't become a martyr figure in the same way. He died alone in a bunker, his body burned in a crater, his empire in ruins. There's nothing heroic or noble about that. The bunker story also gives us insight into the various personality types that were drawn to Nazism and how they reacted when it all fell apart. You had true believers like Goebbels who chose death over living without their ideology. You had opportunists like Goering who tried to position themselves for survival when they saw which way the wind was blowing. You had careerists who'd gone along with the regime and now had to figure out how to escape or explain their involvement. And you had ordinary people, secretaries, soldiers, staff, who'd found themselves caught up in something horrific and were now just trying to survive. The different reactions to the end are fascinating. Some chose suicide, some tried to escape, some stayed loyal to Hitler even after his death. Some immediately started trying to distance themselves from the regime. Some tried to destroy evidence of their involvement. Some kept meticulous records. Everyone had to make choices about what to do in those final chaotic days. The myths and misconceptions. Over the decades since 1945, a whole mythology has grown up around Hitler's death and the final days in the bunker. Let's just gently debunk some of the common myths, because it's important to separate fact from fiction. Myth number 1. Hitler escaped to Argentina or Antarctica or wherever. This one has persisted for decades, despite there being zero credible evidence for it. Yes, there were rumors immediately after the war. Yes, the Soviets were deliberately vague about whether they'd found Hitler's body. Yes, there were some Nazi officials who did escape to South America. But Hitler? No. The evidence for his death in the bunker is overwhelming. We have multiple eyewitness accounts from people who saw his body. We have the Soviet autopsy reports. We have the dental records matching. We have no evidence of any escape plan or possibility. He was in a bunker surrounded by Soviet troops. The idea that he somehow snuck out, got to a plane, flew to Spain or Argentina, and lived out his days quietly is just not supported by anything resembling facts. But it makes for good conspiracy theories, so it persists. Myth number 2. Hitler was killed by someone else rather than committing suicide. Again, no evidence for this. All the eyewitness accounts agree that Hitler and Eva went into their quarters alone and shot himself/took cyanide. Nobody else was in the room. There's no reason to think anyone else killed him. Some people struggle with the idea that Hitler took his own life because they want him to have been punished by someone else, but that's not what happened. He killed himself. That's it. Myth number 3. Hitler died in a heroic last stand fighting Soviet troops. This one is sometimes promoted by neo-Nazi propaganda that tries to romanticize Hitler's death. The reality is much more pathetic. Hitler shot himself on a sofa in a bunker while his capital burned around him. There was nothing heroic about it. He didn't fight, he didn't lead his troops, he hid underground and killed himself. Any attempt to paint this as some kind of noble end is pure fantasy. Myth number 4. The skull fragment that the Russians had was definitely Hitler's. As mentioned earlier, DNA testing in 2009 suggested that skull fragment was actually from a woman. So either it wasn't Hitler's skull, or the testing was flawed, or the Russians had the wrong skull fragment. The jawbone fragments are probably authentic, but the skull is questionable. This doesn't mean Hitler didn't die in the bunker, it just means that particular piece of evidence might not be what everyone thought it was. Myth number 5. There were secret wonder weapons in the bunker that could have turned the war around. Nope. The bunker had some weapons for defense, but there were no secret superweapons. Germany did have various advanced weapons projects going on during the war, jet aircraft, rockets, etc., but none of them were going to change the outcome at that point. The war was lost because Germany was fighting against countries with vastly superior resources and manpower. No amount of wonder weapons was going to fix that. Myth number 6. Hitler was calm and resigned at the end. Some accounts try to portray Hitler's final days as almost philosophical, like he calmly accepted his fate. The reality is more complicated. He had moments of calm, sure, but he also had explosive rages, paranoid accusations, and periods of complete denial. He wasn't some Zen master contemplating the end. He was a broken man swinging between anger, fear, and fantasy. Myth number 7. Eva Braun was forced to be there or didn't understand what was happening. Eva chose to come to Berlin. She chose to stay. She chose to marry Hitler knowing they'd both be dead within days. She was a grown woman who made her own decisions, however we might judge those decisions. Some accounts try to paint her as a victim or as naive, but the evidence suggests she knew exactly what she was doing. She was devoted to Hitler and chose to die with him. That's her decision to own. The psychology of the bunker. Let's think for a moment about what it must have been like psychologically to be in that bunker during those final weeks. Because honestly, it sounds like a nightmare scenario designed to break people's minds. You have the physical environment first. Cramped quarters, no natural light, bad ventilation, constant noise from explosions, the walls shaking, dust falling from the ceiling, the smell of sweat and cigarettes and diesel fumes. No privacy, no escape. You're living underground like you're already buried. Then you have the isolation. You're cut off from the outside world except for radio and telephone. The news that comes in is all bad. Cities falling, armies destroyed, allies betraying you. You're watching on maps as the enemy closes in from all sides. You know you're surrounded. You know there's no way out. You're just waiting to die. And you have the social dynamics. You're trapped with the same people day after day. Tensions must have been incredible. Everyone's stressed, scared, exhausted. There are power struggles. There are old grudges. There's the constant awareness that Hitler could turn on anyone at any moment, like he did with Goering and Fegelein. Nobody's safe. Everyone's walking on eggshells. For the true believers like Goebbels, there was probably a weird kind of exhilaration mixed with the horror. They'd bought completely into the Nazi ideology, and now they were getting their dramatic martyrdom. It was the finale of their opera. They were going to die for their Führer and their cause. In some twisted way, that probably gave them meaning and purpose, even as everything collapsed. For the opportunists and careerists, it must have been terrifying. These were people who'd gone along with the regime for personal gain, and now they were trapped. They couldn't leave without being shot for desertion. They couldn't stay without probably dying when the Soviets arrived. They were just paralyzed, hoping somehow they'd survive. For the ordinary staff, the secretaries, the telephone operators, the guards, they were just caught in something way bigger than themselves. They were doing their jobs, and their jobs happened to be serving one of history's greatest monsters during the apocalypse. Some of them probably didn't fully grasp the enormity of what was happening. They were focused on the immediate, will I survive today? Others must have been having constant existential crises about how they ended up there. The lack of sleep must have made everything worse. Hitler's backward schedule meant nobody got normal rest. The constant artillery meant even when you tried to sleep, you'd be woken up by explosions. People must have been running on adrenaline and exhaustion, which doesn't make for rational thinking. And there was the complete disconnect from reality that Hitler imposed on everyone around him. He was still talking about relief armies and victory when Soviet soldiers were literally in the next block. People in the bunker had to maintain this fiction that somehow things were fine, or at least not as bad as they obviously were, because Hitler couldn't handle reality. It's like everyone had to participate in this group delusion, and that must have been psychologically exhausting. The decision-making in that environment must have been nearly impossible. How do you think clearly when you're sleep-deprived, terrified, trapped underground, watching your world literally explode around you, and your leader is ranting about how the German people don't deserve to live if they can't win? It's a wonder anyone made it out with their sanity intact.
The broader context, why it all fell apart. Let's zoom out a bit and think about how Germany got to this point. Because the bunker was just the final chapter of a much longer story of miscalculation, hubris, and catastrophic decision-making. Hitler's whole strategy was built on quick victories and avoiding sustained warfare. The invasions of Poland, France, the Low Countries, these were rapid campaigns that ended quickly. Germany's economy wasn't built for a long war. They didn't have the resources for it. So Hitler's plan was always to knock out enemies fast before they could mobilize their full strength. This worked until it didn't. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was supposed to be another quick campaign. Hitler literally thought they'd defeat the Soviets in a few months. He told his generals that they just had to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Except it didn't. The Soviets kept fighting. The Germans got bogged down. Winter came. The quick victory turned into a grinding war of attrition. And Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union. The Soviets had more people, more resources, more space to trade for time. They could take massive casualties and keep fighting. Germany couldn't. Every German soldier lost was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed was a permanent loss. The Wehrmacht was strongest in mid-1941, and it was all downhill from there. Then Hitler declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. Why? He didn't have to. The US was focused on Japan, but Hitler decided to honor his alliance with Japan and declared war on America. So now Germany was fighting the Soviets in the east, the British in the west, and the Americans were entering the war with their massive industrial capacity. It was suicide. There was no way Germany could win against that coalition. By 1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad and the defeat in North Africa, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that Germany was going to lose. But Hitler couldn't accept defeat. He kept ordering his armies to hold every position, never retreat, fight to the last man. This strategy just got more Germans killed faster. A competent commander would have used mobile defense, traded space for time, tried to bleed the Allies enough that they'd negotiate. Hitler just ordered everyone to hold and die. The July 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, the Valkyrie plot, was basically a bunch of German officers realizing the war was lost and trying to kill Hitler so they could negotiate peace before Germany was completely destroyed. It failed. Hitler survived. The conspirators were executed, and any chance of Germany getting out of the war with anything left was gone.
By early 1945, the situation was hopeless. The Soviets were pushing into Germany from the east. The Americans and British were across the Rhine in the west. German cities were being bombed constantly. The economy was collapsing. There was no oil, no gasoline, limited ammunition. Armies existed on paper but had no equipment or manpower. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies, and there was no way out. But Hitler still wouldn't surrender. He kept talking about secret weapons that would turn the war around. He kept drawing up plans for counteroffensives. He kept believing that the Allied coalition would break apart. He was living in fantasy while Germany burned. This is what made the bunker period so darkly absurd. Hitler was moving imaginary armies around on maps while real Soviet soldiers were blocks away. He was planning for the future of a Reich that had hours left to live. He was acting like he was still in control when he literally couldn't control anything beyond his concrete shelter. The whole Nazi system had been built around Hitler's will. What he wanted became policy. His hunches became strategy. His prejudices became law. And when his will became disconnected from reality, the entire system became dysfunctional. There was nobody who could tell him no, nobody who could force him to face facts, nobody who could make him surrender or step aside. So the war just continued until it literally couldn't anymore, until Soviet troops were in Berlin and there was nothing left.
The Holocaust and the bunker. We need to talk about something that often gets overlooked in stories about the bunker. The Holocaust was still happening during those final weeks. Even as Berlin was being destroyed, even as the regime was collapsing, the machinery of genocide was still running. Concentration camps were still operating in early 1945. Auschwitz wasn't liberated until January 27, 1945. Other camps continued until they were liberated by Allied forces. In the final weeks and months of the war, as the Germans retreated, they forced concentration camp prisoners on death marches, trying to move them away from advancing Allied armies. Thousands died on these marches from exhaustion, starvation, or execution. Hitler's last political testament, dictated in the bunker, spent more words on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories than on anything else. Even at the end, even with everything falling apart, he was still obsessed with his hatred of Jews. He still blamed them for everything. He called on Germans to continue the racial struggle. The Holocaust wasn't just a side effect of his regime, it was central to his worldview, right up until his final moments. This matters because sometimes there's a tendency to view the bunker period as almost separate from the rest of Nazi crimes. Like, here's this dramatic story of Hitler's final days, and here's the Holocaust, and they're different things. But they're not different things. The Holocaust was the logical culmination of the ideology that led Hitler into that bunker. The genocidal anti-Semitism that drove the Holocaust was the same ideology that drove the war. You can't separate them. Some of the people in the bunker were directly involved in the Holocaust. Goebbels had promoted anti-Semitic propaganda throughout the regime. Bormann had administered policies that enabled the Holocaust. Even the secretaries and staff, the seemingly innocent people just doing their jobs, were working for a regime that was actively murdering millions. The fact that Hitler spent his final hours still talking about the Jewish conspiracy shows how central this was to everything. It wasn't just about territorial expansion or military conquest. It was about racial ideology, about creating a world purged of everyone Hitler deemed inferior or dangerous. That's what those 6 Goebbels children died for, not for Germany, but for that ideology. Reflections on power and collapse. As we drift toward the end of this long, dark story, let's think about what the bunker story tells us about power and its collapse. Because there are some universal lessons here that go beyond just Hitler and the Nazis. First, there's the isolation of absolute power. Hitler had constructed a system where nobody could really challenge him. He surrounded himself with yes-men and true believers. Anyone who questioned him was removed or sidelined. This meant that by the end, he had nobody around him who could tell him the truth. The military conferences in the bunker were theater. Officers would give their reports knowing Hitler would reject anything he didn't want to hear. Real information couldn't reach him because he'd destroyed the mechanisms for real information to flow upward. This is a pattern you see in authoritarian regimes throughout history. The leader becomes increasingly isolated. Reality becomes whatever the leader says it is. Bad news is suppressed or explained away, and eventually the leader is living in a completely fictional world while the real world collapses around them. Second, there's the decay of institutions. The Nazi state was never well organized. It was a chaos of competing agencies and personal fiefdoms. But by 1945, it had completely broken down. Different Nazi leaders were operating independently, sometimes working against each other. The military was fighting a war it couldn't win with resources it didn't have. The civilian government was barely functioning. Everything had degraded into a scramble for survival. This happens because authoritarian systems don't have legitimate mechanisms for succession or adaptation. Everything depends on the leader. When the leader becomes incapacitated or dysfunctional, there's no system to take over. It just falls apart. Third, there's the question of loyalty and complicity. Most people in that bunker weren't fanatics. They were careerists or ordinary people who'd ended up in an extraordinary situation. But they stayed. They followed orders. They participated in maintaining the fiction that Hitler was in charge and the Reich would survive. Why? Part of it was fear. Leaving could mean being shot for desertion. Part was inertia. They'd been doing this job, following these people for years, and changing course was psychologically difficult. Part was denial. It was easier to keep going than to face what was really happening. And part was probably a lack of imagination for what else they could do. This is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil, not through passionate commitment to the cause necessarily, but just through going along, following orders, not rocking the boat, not taking responsibility for what's happening around them. Fourth, there's the absolute failure of Hitler's leadership at the end. A real leader, facing inevitable defeat, would have tried to minimize the suffering of their people. They'd negotiate surrender terms. They'd try to preserve something. Hitler did the opposite. He ordered scorched earth. He said the German people didn't deserve to survive if they couldn't win. He spent resources on his suicide bunker instead of civilian defense. His last political testament was full of accusations and hatred. He didn't care about Germany or Germans. He cared about his ideology and his own place in history. This is the ultimate indictment of Führer-principle leadership. When everything depends on one person's will, and that person turns out to be a narcissistic, paranoid, ideology-obsessed monster, everything burns.
The Long Shadow. Nearly 80 years after Hitler's death in the bunker, we're still dealing with the consequences and legacy of what happened. The bunker isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a symbol of how far things can go wrong when certain forces are unleashed. The Holocaust remains the defining genocide of modern history, the benchmark against which all other atrocities are measured. The war Hitler started killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, including about 27 million Soviet citizens. Entire cities were destroyed, populations were displaced. The political map of Europe was redrawn. The modern world was shaped by World War II in countless ways. The division of Germany after the war, the Cold War, the creation of Israel, the decolonization of the European empires, the United Nations, nuclear weapons, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of these came out of the war and its aftermath. The bunker was where that war ended in Europe, so in a sense, the bunker is where the post-war world began. The memory of the Holocaust and World War II has shaped how we think about human rights,
about genocide, about international law, about the responsibility to prevent atrocities. Never again became a rallying cry. The Nuremberg trials established principles about crimes against humanity that are still relevant today. The war created a determination that something like this could not be allowed to happen again. Of course, genocides have happened again. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. The lesson hasn't been fully learned, but the memory of the Holocaust provides a moral framework for understanding these events and, theoretically, mobilizing to prevent or stop them. The bunker also looms over how we think about leadership and power. Hitler is the ultimate cautionary tale about charismatic authoritarianism. The image of him dying in a bunker, paranoid and delusional, his empire in ruins around him, serves as a reminder of where that path leads. When contemporary leaders show authoritarian tendencies, someone will inevitably make the Hitler comparison. The bunker is the end of that story. There's also the question of how we remember and commemorate these events. Germany has spent decades grappling with how to deal with Nazi history. The decision to destroy the bunker rather than preserve it was part of that grappling. How do you acknowledge history without creating shrines to evil? How do you educate without glorifying? Germany's approach has been to be unflinchingly honest about the past while making sure Nazi symbols and sites don't become rallying points for extremists. The bunker reminds us that history doesn't end cleanly. Hitler died, but his ideas didn't die with him. Neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism still exist. Authoritarian movements still rise. The forces that brought Hitler to power, economic anxiety, national humiliation, scapegoating of minorities, cult of personality, these still exist in various forms around the world. The final thoughts. So here we are, at the end of this long, slow journey through Hitler's final days. We've drifted through the cramped corridors of the Führerbunker, watched a regime collapse, seen a dictator reduced to a trembling, paranoid wreck, witnessed suicides and murders and desperate attempts to escape reality. What are we left with? Honestly, mostly sadness and horror. Not just at what happened in the bunker, but at everything that led to the bunker. The millions dead in the Holocaust, the tens of millions dead in the war, the cities destroyed, the lives ruined, the trauma inflicted on entire generations. The bunker story is ultimately about failure. Hitler failed at everything he set out to do. He wanted to create a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted 12 years. He wanted Germany to dominate Europe. Germany was divided and occupied. He wanted to eliminate Jews from Europe. The Jewish people survived, and his regime is remembered as the greatest evil of modern history. He wanted to be remembered as a great leader. He's remembered as the worst kind of monster. But his failure came at an unfathomable cost to millions of innocent people. That's the tragedy. It's not tragic that Hitler died in a bunker. It's tragic that he took so much of the world down with him before he got there. The bunker teaches us about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of institutions that can resist authoritarian impulses, the need for people to stand up and say no when they see evil happening. It teaches us about the banality of evil, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary horror just by following orders and not questioning what they're doing. It teaches us about the consequences of hatred, of scapegoating, of dehumanizing others. Most of all, maybe, the bunker teaches us about human capacity for self-deception. Hitler died believing he was right, believing history would vindicate him, believing the German people had failed him rather than that he had failed them. He never faced what he'd done. He never took responsibility. He just checked out. The people around him engaged in their own self-deception. The true believers who thought dying for Hitler meant something. The careerists who told themselves they were just doing their jobs. The ordinary staff who convinced themselves they weren't really part of it. Everyone finding ways to avoid facing the full reality of what they were involved in. This capacity for self-deception, for justification, for compartmentalization, it's very human. We all do it to some degree.
The bunker just shows us what happens when it's taken to an extreme, when entire systems are built around maintaining comfortable lies rather than facing uncomfortable truths. As we close this out, it's worth remembering that the bunker wasn't just where Hitler died. It was where thousands of other people were dying every day in the battle for Berlin. Soviet soldiers were dying taking the city. German soldiers were dying defending it. Civilians were dying in basements and rubble. The bunker was a tiny drama playing out while a much larger tragedy unfolded across the city. Hitler's death on April 30th, 1945, meant the war in Europe would end a week later. It meant the killing would stop, at least in Europe. Soviet soldiers wouldn't have to keep fighting their way through Berlin. German soldiers wouldn't have to keep dying for a lost cause. Civilians could start trying to survive in the ruins rather than actively fleeing combat. In that sense, Hitler's suicide was one of the better things he ever did. Not because it took courage, it didn't. Not because it was noble, it wasn't. But because it finally ended his ability to keep the war going. If he'd been captured alive, who knows how long fanatical defenders might have kept fighting. His death made it clear to everyone that it was over. The bunker today, or rather the parking lot that covers where the bunker was, is unremarkable. That's appropriate. Hitler doesn't deserve monuments or memorials. The most fitting memorial to his regime is the absence of any memorial, just normal life going on above where he died. People parking their cars, walking to work, living their lives in a peaceful and democratic Berlin. The story of the bunker reminds us that even the most powerful, even those who seem unstoppable, eventually fall. The Third Reich seemed invincible in 1940. 5 years later, its leader was dead in a hole in the ground, his body burned in a crater, his empire destroyed. Power built on hatred and violence doesn't last. It collapses, often taking everything around it too. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe take some comfort in that. Evil regimes fall, tyrants die. The arc of history is long, but it bends away from people like Hitler. The bunker is both a horror and a reassurance. A horror because of what happened there and what led there, but a reassurance because it shows us that even the worst eventually end. Sleep well, knowing that the bunker is buried. Hitler is long dead, and the world, however imperfectly, chose a different path forward from that dark April day in 1945. And that, finally, is the end of our slow drift through the last days of Adolf Hitler. Thanks for letting me tell you this long, dark story. Tomorrow is a new day, far removed from those grim bunker corridors. The parking lot in Berlin will still be there, unremarkable and ordinary, which is exactly how it should be. Good night.